So it's engagement, engagement, engagement. I'm just curious, do you have a Chinese name?
Yes, I do.
Can you tell us the Chinese name?
It's Bo Crashore.
Oh, gosh. There you go, he's become Chinese. Right, we've heard, I think, 5 very good pointed responses to investors' paper. So I'd like to now open questions to the floor. I've already seen hands, and I think I've seen Prof. Moniz first. So what I intend to do is to take perhaps 3 questions at one go, and then you can pose your question to either our lead speaker or to any of our panelists, or just generally, and we'll try to respond. So Prof, please, and then Prof. Hamzin afterwards.
Thank you. I have a.
Do we need a mic for this? We are taking proceedings.
I can do it.
Maybe I can.
I have a small observation for Professor from China, and then a question for Jaishankar. The observation is that he has said about the changing strategic equations of India, particularly with the US, which is worrying China. I mean, India coped with the Chinese changing equations with the US and the Soviet Union, or Russia now. Why it is that China cannot cope with it? So Jaishankar, I think I must heartily compliment you for a very, very balanced and rarely heard analysis of India-China relations. I have 2 questions related to that. Did I note it correctly that you said China sought to change the power balance in the subcontinent? If you said so, I would request you to elaborate on it. The second question is that which refers to one of your predecessors who wrote a fascinating, who made a fascinating speech in the memory of your father. And he said, deception is part of China's strategic culture. Wonder if you would like to react to that.
Prof.
First, let me thank you, Master Jaishankar, for such a wonderful, comprehensive, and lively speech about China-India relationship. My question is about Burma or Myanmar. We know that both China and India has fundamental interests in this country, which is undergoing very fundamental changes. We also know that President Obama just made a very successful visit to this changing country. So what is your take about Myanmar and Burma, given what's happening right now over there?
Thanks, Prof. I see a hand from Rahul Mukherjee. And we'll pause for responses.
Rahul Mukherjee from South Asian Studies. My question to Master Jaishankar. He's probably the only person who can most meaningfully reflect on a question like this. 2 questions actually. One is that when you draw a balance sheet, do you think that this interdependence will produce the peace? That's one. By peace, I mean a situation where India will not feel that it is getting encircled by China. A situation where China will not feel that the United States can use it for a containment strategy. A peace where China will feel comfortable welcoming India into the high table of the Security Council. And the second question is that if India has to use a strategy of interdependence to promote global cooperation through India-China relations and peace, how can it do it better than what it's doing now? I mean, how is it that that engagement can be used instrumentally to promote peace through cooperation?
Thank you. I think most questions are for you, investors, so I'll ask you to start first.
Okay, let me begin with Professor Muni's question, clarification question. Actually, what I said, let me read it once again. I said China has sought to influence the balance of power within the Indian subcontinent, and this has consequences that continue to this day. Now, the reason I chose those words were that I was delicately trying not to mention other countries. But the fact is, this was part of what I call the first narrative, the 1962 based narrative. And a number of things happened around the 1962 period, which included changes in Chinese policy vis-a-vis countries in South Asia beyond India. So that is really what I was trying to do.
It is persisting.
Yes, it has consequences. I mean, consequences in the sense it could be the momentum continuing or the policy continuing. But the short point I was making was that the balance of power within the Indian subcontinent is part of the first narrative, the difficult narrative. The second question you asked me about, yes, I did read Ambassador Shamsaran's lecture. I think every culture, every strategic culture has its own advocacy of deception. I'm not there to, I wouldn't say right or wrong, but I would point out, for example, so does the Indian strategic culture. I mean, the Mahabharata is replete with examples of the value of deception. So I am not sure I would frankly pick uniquely on the Chinese as a cultural trait that they are more deceitful than other people. I'm not sure I would do that. On Myanmar, it's tough to answer a question, what is your take in Myanmar, other than to say that things are moving better, and I think obviously the Myanmaris think so, and I think all neighbors of Myanmar think so. And we have seen develop. I was here in 2007 when our Prime Minister came to Singapore for the East Asia Summit, and I think that was his first meeting with, at that time, Prime Minister Thein Sein, who had just taken over. So I think very few of us would have predicted that the situation would have reached where it has. Now, having said that, I mean, this is sort of early days. Where it's going to go, it's very, very hard to say. But I would also remind you that President Obama had a very different take on Myanmar when he came to India. In fact, he made very pointed remarks about it in his speech to the Indian Parliament. So that is also something which people should not forget. On the interdependence, there's this whole how much security and stability does interdependence buy you? I think that's a very tough question. There are people who would, often in literature people point to the First World War as a period where there was interdependence between Germany and UK and say, well, interdependence didn't mean very much. Today, there would be people who would say, well, you can have countries in Northeast Asia which are economically extremely interdependent, but which have still a high degree of political tension among them. So I don't think interdependence is a complete solution, but if you give me a choice between having interdependence and not having interdependence, I would vote for interdependence anytime. Because I think it's clearly a net plus. It may not be sufficient, but it has clearly great value. On the other part of the question, which is how do you ensure a situation where the Chinese don't feel that, I'm putting it very more sharply than perhaps the questioner, they don't feel that India is part of a containment of China. I think I would make one remark about what Dr. Goh called the third narrative, which is, you have a point there, which is, at the moment India-China have a first narrative built on the 62 conflict and the border dispute and so on, and the second narrative which is very economic and global issues driven. But there is a third narrative of a natural competition among states. In a sense, the answer, what Rahul asked was answered by Professor Muni, which is that countries will do this. I mean, the Chinese had relationships with Soviet Union and with the United States. I mean, today, my sense is a lot of the Chinese concern about what is happening between India and the US is because the Chinese also think that India has behavioral mode which is very similar to the Chinese behavioral mode in using the United States. So the third narrative is there, and the third narrative is a permanent fixture of international relations. It's not going to go away. I mean, nations will be as competitive as individuals are. It's just something, if they were not competitive, people like me would be in business.
Okay, I think I'll give Prof. Paul time to respond to Prof. Muni's question first, and then I'll ask the other panelists.
Very great. I totally agree that there's country between, the competition between country are natural. This is the balance power theory is coming from the security dilemma in international relations. Everybody is worried about his neighbors if it's there's no trust. So that is why I prefer that in China and India relations. That's why I do the economic integration, people-to-people exchanges, and strategic dialogue is very important for two of us. It's two giants in Asia, and we cannot survive without the cooperation. So in that context, circumstances, we need more talks to build this trust, to avoid security dilemma and escalation. Even because we have so many bilateral, even including the border disputes particularly. So I'm wondering, just one more sentence is, in the 1980s, when China is talking with Soviet Union, wants because China get alliance, not it's oral alliance or not written alliance with the United States to deal with the sovereign threat at that time. But China at that time sacrificed a lot over Taiwan Island. That is why I prefer just later one friend mentioned that this is strategic independence. That is very important. That's why in the late 80s, Deng Xiaoping mentioned that we should maintain a non-alliance policy. We should do also independence diplomacy. So that is, I think we can learn each other.
Any of the right, I see a few hands now. I think it's gentleman in front, the 1, 2, and 3. Okay, sir, you please.
My name is Vishal. I'm from PwC. But I'm here to ask a question not from a PwC perspective, but more from the think tank part of our Dakshina Foundation. And my question is more that given the leadership transition that's going to happen in China, say in March, which we already know who's going to come in, do you think that will change, give a chance to change fundamentally some of these narratives that were mentioned?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Einstein, this person. Firstly, sir, thank you very much for coming back on behalf, and in respect to the High Commissioner. I think we miss him for a very long time. Now, and my regards and my respect for the terms of reference, which I think it is, as Prof was saying, after 50 years, and the question of that I think is either a pre-thought or afterthought. The term of reference very much here is, I think it is half century thereafter. And the question is half empty, half full. So that's the question. and when I look at it, when you were saying that diplomacy dimension, first question for investment, with regard to your question of the unthinkable situation of the poor understanding of intellectual dimension. Are you referring to here in the context of intellectual deficit or intellectual laziness between parties, that because if you look at the technology term of the key or the killer app is not there. There seems to be a lacking of question of picking up the tandem the tenet is not understood. I don't quite recall as what exactly the problem is, and that's the problem. And that's a problem it is identified and really looked into. So that is what basically, yeah. Okay. Now, secondly, with regard to the Chinese factor, that the Chinese understand. For example, Dr. Goh, I did not ask yesterday, and since that Ambassador Zhang is today here, it would be good if the dialogue would have the Chinese ambassador on the bench, actually. And that would be equal respect. Because you know why? Because without academic dimension of perspective, it's only one. But whereas the thank you.
Okay, so I'll make sure that the investor answer is as well. Actually, Mrs. Liu as well. Thank you very much. Okay, then I'll take just the.
Good morning. My question is to Ambassador Jaishankar. My name is Tanvi Ratna. I'm a student of foreign policy, especially in the China relations.
Can you speak up a little?
Hello?
Yeah.
My name is Tanvi Ratna. I'm a student of India-China relations at the Lee Kuan Yew School. I was actually also an intern with the MBA China desk this summer. And my question to Ambassador Jaishankar is, as a young person who's very invested in this India-China relationship and wants to work on this trust deficit issue between the countries, what options do I have, like, apart from joining the diplomatic service? What are some other things I could do?
Good question. Okay, one, then we'll pause for responses.
Sharani from the Lee Kuan Yew School. My question is, India and China are confronted with very common non-traditional security issues like energy and food security, as you mentioned. And they stand to be competing more than cooperating in this. So how do you see the possibility of more cooperation in these issues? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your great conception. Nalin, I'll come back to you in a while. I'll let the panelists respond to them. So I guess maybe I'll start with Prof. Goh first about the leadership transition, and then I'll ask Professor Wu, and then
There's a question to Ambassador.
no, maybe you tell us your views first. We will ask the ambassador to come on in a while. The leadership transition, is it likely to lead to some change in the directive that we talked about?
It's a hard question. I'm not diplomatic, but I would say speak the truth. So.
The diplomats would speak the truth.
Yes, in China, I think Chinese care about our leadership transition most. Anyone say that in the United States or any other country said we care that most. No, Chinese care the most. We care about our future. Well, how we understand this leadership transition? I remember I talked with foreign experts, 7 years ago. It's 3 years ago, I remember. We said, how do you think of Xi Jinping in next term? I said, Chinese foreign policy will be, as a member of the ambassador last night mentioned, will be more assertive. Of course, because you're right, your power is right. That's of course. It's natural. The second, the Chinese government still doing almost follow that. Even Deng Xiaoping's the principle of foreign policy is 韬光养晦 in some cases. When we're talking about Chinese international environment situation. So that means case by case. That's been foreign policy. So many Chinese people, I think, have very high expectation of this Sabada. And later, I think we many are satisfied with the results. And Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang now, just yesterday, Li Keqiang delivered a talk to the ministry level Ganbu. He said, if we don't do more reform, you should be responsible to that. You have to be responsible to the historic effect. That means So that there's very heavy pressure from the central government to the local government. So I'm looking forward to more changes. And the Chinese people, I think more like me, I think we are still promising that China has another good future. Yeah. At least in 10 years.
Well, I'm not an expert in this. Maybe just a couple of points, my personal opinion. The first point is that in the last, I left China more than 20 years ago, so as an observer outside China, I see the continuation of raising the Chinese policy from one generation to another, at least in the last 10 years. So I don't expect huge changes in terms of Chinese policy. But I do expect some changes over time, gradually. Why is that? One point I could make is that both leaders, Mr. Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang, were born after the foundation of the People's Republic. They are very different from the last generation, because those guys are all born before 1949. But these two were born in the 50s. I think that they will be different, but how different they are going to be, we have to wait and see. Thank you.
Before I ask investor, I'm going to ask Prakash, from the business perspective, is there going to be any difference?
Well, as a foreign national in China, we look at this very, very seriously. But the Chinese have done such a fantastic job on transition in the past that we hope they'll do it again. Are there going to be, do we expect some major changes? Are there going to be any U-turns, 180-degree changes? I don't think so. I would tend to agree with him when he said it will be gradual, it will be slow, it will be different, it will be probably a little more modern. And that's very welcome.
Swan, do you have anything? Then I'll ask Ambassador because there are a few follow-up questions with the young ladies as well. So, well, your views are very important also, I mean, in terms of how you see all these.
Well, on the leadership transition, I'll come back next year and let you But on the 50 years, half century, you know, let me go back to your point. You spoke about what you thought was the typographical error, why I picked 50 years after. You know, many of you will be familiar with Alexander Dumas' book, Three Musketeers. There's a sequel of that book called 20 Years After. And the short point of 20 years after was that the relationship between the Three Musketeers and D'Artagnan was unpredictable 20 years later. So when I looked at 50 years after, I was wondering to myself, who would have imagined in 62 that, you know, we'd be today worrying about trade and worrying about, you know, intellectual distance and global issues and so on. I think there is a lot to be said for unpredictability of relationships between states, and perhaps that is something we need to think about. On the intellectual distance, you know, if you live in China and you travel, which I do a lot, particularly to Chinese archaeological and historical sites, there's an amazing imprint of India in China. You know, I've actually been to sites where in the middle of even, I'm not just talking the obvious, you know, Buddhism. I've actually seen in grottos in China, in the middle of Buddhist carvings, someone has done murga, you know, and this goes back to, this is in Yunga, in Datong, which probably goes back almost 1800 years. So I think what has happened is that because of partly the colonial period in India and the period of foreign presence in China, and then just when the relationship was sort of beginning to come together, we had the border dispute and then 62. We've actually forgotten a lot of our shared history of continents. I mean, common sense would tell us you can't have two such big societies living next to each other and not having extensive continents. But yet, if you ask most people, that is not the impression that people have. And if there is a single book I would recommend, because I just reread it recently, It is a book written in 1944 by Professor P.C. Bakchi, who spoke, I think, about 20 languages, including a lot of languages in China today, for which there are very few speakers left. We are actually, I refer to it in my talk, we are actually translating it and publishing it in China as part of a 1962 gesture. But if you actually read that book, and the book actually begins, his preface begins with the sentence that he's written it in 44. Now in 44, as someone reminded us, you actually had a Chinese force which was being trained in Bihar to be sent back into Yunnan. You had the Chongqing supply route which was going on. Chiang Kai-shek was actually pressing Churchill in international conferences saying independence for India is an important foreign policy objective of China. And actually he created a lot of bad blood between China and the UK because he took up India's cause. So you have a period in the 40s where India and China, P.C. Bakchi begins this way. He says the war has actually brought us closer and made us remember a past that we have all forgotten. But unfortunately another war came and closed it once more. So I think this sense of what are contacts where, sort of what is our shared history, because if you don't remember your past, you're not going to have any sense of working together in terms of common goals, because the sense of distance remains very strong. And when we push for Chinese language teaching, it isn't just the language. I mean, it's not a transactional utilitarian gesture. I mean, it is a sense of some understanding of China, which people in India actually very badly need. I had the good fortune of going to a university where Professor Muni taught, and a lot of us learned about China at that time. But that's not really common in India. I mean, most people have a very, very limited sense of Chinese culture, Chinese history, Chinese politics. The career advice. I would say try to become like Elizabeth Taylor's second husband. Do it well and make a difference. And I think that's Richard London, if I'm not mistaken. Was it second or third? Third. Okay. But really, if frankly, if I were 25 today, I would be looking to embark on a business career in China. I mean, if I was sitting there, my model would not be here, my model would be there. Someone who can run 205 centers of IT education in India, I think that in China, that I think makes a huge difference. And business today actually can play a bridging role. Again, I'm not overplaying it. I don't think they will solve all problems. I pointed out to you there are challenges in the business world. But I think if there is a difference to be made, it is actually perhaps to underplay the argumentation and boost the transactions. I think that would really make a big difference. And a bit about non-traditional issues. There are two fundamental commonalities between China and India. One is that they are still developing economies, and that gives you a whole set of interests as developing economies. So that's really what shapes your attitude towards climate change, what shapes your attitude towards trade. Secondly, they are still, to global decision making, still relative outliers. I mean, we are still looking at very much a Western-based global decision making model. And after all, that's the basis for BRICS, which is the states who have not been, in a sense, given their due place. And also, I think because of our history, we both have very strong sovereignty concerns. So I think that creates a lot of convergences on non-traditional security issues, and in a sense, perhaps offsets some of the natural competition which might happen in more traditional international programs.
Thank you. Now I've got three questions from the rear, so then I'll come back. I think it's Nalin first, right? Nalin, and then Rona Joy, then I see Surya, and then Kanti. Okay.
My name is Nalin, I'm from ISAS, and this is a question for Ambassador Jaishankar. And it's a question about the media, which you referred to very briefly in your talk about the media dialogue, and I think you said that it's being driven at the moment through the governments. So my first question is if you could flesh that out a little bit. I mean, I guess I understand ZTV was given landing rights recently, there's a media dialogue which is on. If you can tell us a bit more, as much as you think appropriate, about what really is this dialogue about and what are the next steps in this. And the second is a more fundamental question on the influence of the media in your daily job. I think in 2008, 2009, the last National Security Advisor went on television when it became a very big story, the border transgression, said, if you guys don't stop, someone somewhere will lose their cool. And he said in 1962, we didn't have these 24-hour news channels. So what I'm really asking you to, not to put too fine a point on it, how do you deal with, say, the Times Nows of the world, or with channels that, on both sides, with the excessive jingoism and less of accuracy on this? Do you see it as purely as an irritant, or is it a fundamental problem?
Thanks, Alex. Aronaja?
Monoja Sen and ISAS. Two quick questions for the ambassador. One is, since your talk is 50 years after, in 1962, the 50 years we saw not an explosion, but a series of articles in newspapers and some discussion on the ramifications of 62, or the documents which weren't available. We sort of don't really have the true picture. So that was one of the things that came out. But could you say a little bit on the perception in China, how the 62, the 50th anniversary, well, you did mention the word airbrush once. Is it something that's not sort of in public discourse anymore? And number two, the question is, you've been talking about teaching Chinese and CBSE, the Central Board for Secondary Education in India, has, I think last year, introduced Mandarin as a third language, I think. Where do you think India will get the resources, if it realistically has to teach Chinese, say, at the school level?
Sonia, please.
So we are also from ISAS. So the question is addressed to Ambassador Jaishankar. Much has been said about the possibility or the potentiality of India being used as a pawn by the US against China. As an Indian ambassador who has so much of experience in dealing with China, have you got any sense that the US and China are coming together on any big issue against India? That's one. And the second question is, some time ago, there were concerns, so-called security concerns about Chinese companies in India. Do you still think that that's an issue? Or if it has been an issue in the past, how was it resolved, if it has been resolved at all? Thank you.
Kati, please.
Kati Bajpai, LKY School. The Chinese imprint on India, I think, is going to be vented in a talk you probably have heard about. Amitabh Ghosh, the novelist, is coming this weekend and will be speaking. So, and his talk is on the effects of China on modern Indians. So I think that should be a kind of counterpart to what Jaishankar was saying, an important talk. But I have a question about some of the nitty-gritty issues that perhaps you didn't mention very much, which might be up for dialogue, and if you see any movement on them. One is the issue of a nuclear dialogue between India and China. On the Indian side, there's been quite a lot of enthusiasm to engage China on the issue, but there seems to have been some reluctance on the Chinese side. As a practical matter, that would seem to be a no-brainer. So the Chinese attitude seems a little puzzling. If both sides have nuclear weapons, you'd think they both would want some rules of the road and some understanding of how they're going to use those weapons. Second relates to, of course, a similar problem relating to the navies. As the two navies push up into each other's kind of maritime zones of influence, the Indian Navy has been up in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and the Chinese Navy is going to be more of a presence in the Indian Ocean. Do they need rules of the road there? There was some hint that there would be a naval dialogue between the two sides, possibly of naval CBMs, which we just don't have at this point. The United States and the Soviet Union had, in 1972, an incidents at sea kind of agreement. There's something like that and more that India and China now need to pursue for the future. Third, there are at least two other issues for the future, that one of which could be a game changer, perhaps both could be possibly in a negative sense. One is the future of Afghanistan, of course. As the United States pulls out in about a year and a half, or very much diminishes its presence. What are the prospects of India, China, Pakistan and others really seriously engaging the issue of the future of Afghanistan? The prospects of fundamentalism and extremism there would bite both the Chinese in Xinjiang and of course South Asia. And the other, which I don't want to be misunderstood on this issue, in the presence of two ambassadors, but there is the issue of the possibility of discussions quietly otherwise on Tibet, and the impact that might have as the Tibetan leadership ages and transitions occur there. Willy-nilly, India and China will have to think about some issues there. Is there any prospect of dialogue? Is that completely a no-go zone for other countries, even in the private?
I'm afraid we have to answer all the questions.
Okay, let me run through them fairly quickly. I think beginning with the media issue. Today media in both countries actually play a very big role. And one of my surprises when I went to China was really how aggressive Chinese media was in dealing with issues domestic and foreign. I think we have this static picture derived from past the 1960s and 70s that it's a very compliant, very boring media. Actually, if you are at the receiving end, it's not that different from Indian media. I still would say, okay, Indian media is a league of its own, but still, it's there is a lot of questioning and a lot of I would say articulate, a lot of free speech and pushing by the Chinese media. Now, what we've tried to do really is we've actually taken delegations of Chinese media. Usually these are editors and senior journalists from the print, from the TV, from magazines, from websites, and we take them to India. We do this fairly regularly. We do about 3-4 of this a year. On an average, about 15 to 20 people are taken, and we actually give them exposure to a high level of Indian leadership. So they typically would meet national security advisor or foreign secretary or the heads of CII or FICCI. And we take them to private companies, we take them to universities, and we found it's actually made some difference. That people have come back from India with a I wouldn't say that suddenly they underwent a conversion, but certainly they ended up with a more balanced view. Now, at some point of time, I noticed, and I think Ambassador Chang Yan here sort of gets the credit, we found the Chinese were doing the same thing. The Chinese were also bringing teams of Indian media to China and taking them around. So I think when I refer to the fact that there's more media activity and government is today supporting it, it's in a sense, we've seen this particularly after 2009, far more sort of interactions and travels by correspondents, by editors, commentators, etc.
Indians working in Chinese media.
Sorry? Yeah, there's a lot of Indians. Yeah, there are Indians working in Chinese media as well. On the influence of the media, I think it's not realistic for us to think that media should give up a good story because government doesn't like it or people in diplomacy are uncomfortable with it. They've got their business to run, we've got ours to run, and we've got to find a way of dealing with that. And frankly, this has been a bit of a challenge in China because I think there are often expectations from the Chinese system. What they say, please give proper guidance to your media. Now, you know, anybody who's dealt with the Indian media, no guidance is I mean, it's not part of our, you know, media history because we have other thoughts than coming. I think the way to deal with that is, in a sense, staying ahead of the game, which is, you know, you monitor the stories, you wait for, you sort of become a pre-breaking news embassy. I mean, I carry 3 phones with me and 5 accounts all the time because I am checking that anything that happens, I should know before the breaking news guys know it, so that I am in a position to deal with it and actually try and shape it as it unfolds. Ideally, I even shape the unfolding if I can. But I have got to change my way of working to deal with this media situation. The media is not going to change its way of working in deference to our sensibilities. The question of how is China playing 1962? China, I think Chinese media has been very cautious. There have been, I haven't seen in People's Daily, in Xinhua or in PLA Daily, any suo moto commentary on the 1962 conflict at all. Other papers have carried commentaries, and often I would say the peg on which those stories are run is something which happens out of India. You know, someone has made some comment in India, so that becomes an issue of debate in India, and the Chinese feel, or someone in China feels compelled to comment on that. So, for example, would the use of air power in 1962 have made a difference in the outcome? As you know, it was debated in India, and then there were comments in China about the debate in India. So I think a fair description of the Chinese attitude towards 1962 has been very reactive and very cautious. On teaching Mandarin, where are you going to get the resources from China? The Chinese government, the Ministry of Education, has an agency called Hanban. And Hanban actually runs courses for teaching. They are, by the way, the folks who run Confucius centers. So they actually teach language teachers abroad. So this is a multi-year, complicated, but ambitious initiative. So what we need to do is probably, we are looking at a number, we still haven't got a fix, but probably about 100 teachers in India who sort of first go to China and spend a few years in China, and in a sense become trainee teachers. And then they in turn kind of teach people in India. So it's not going to be something that's going to happen overnight. But having said that, we've had some experience. We introduced Japanese as a language in 2005, if my memory serves me right. And I believe today there are about 100 schools in India which teach Japanese as a third language. But in that case, the Japan Foundation, I think, came to India and did a lot of these teacher training programs. So we actually are thinking of Hanban as the Chinese partner. We've signed an agreement. We're sort of moving on that. US and China coming together. I think there's history there. I mean, there's history there going back to the 70s and subsequently a few times after that. So in that third narrative I spoke about, where nations compete with each other, you know, you obviously want competition to be as advantageous to you as possible. And if major players sort of find common causes which are against your interests, it is a matter of concern. At the moment, I really cannot think of any issue where that's going to happen. So it's a theoretical concern. I concede it happened in the past, but if you ask me, is it something that's going to happen in the near future? My imagination has its limits. I can't think of any issue where Indian interests would be adversely affected in that situation. Chinese companies in India, do you have security concerns? I think we're getting more comfortable with each other. There are areas, some of it is in the public domain, so it's not a secret. There are industries like sectors like telecom which have been affected by security concerns. I think some of the infrastructure areas also have security sensitivities. I don't think it is something we need to be apologetic about. I think every country has its security concerns. China has its, US has its, I'm sure Singapore has its. Everybody draws a red line somewhere and says, it's a level playing field up to the red line, and beyond the red line, it's my sovereign prerogative to allow people and not allow people. I think what is important is to be very upfront about it. And my own sense is, if we actually have frank and direct conversations with the Chinese official done, I think people want to know what is the scope. I don't think China will push us beyond our levels of comfort. Nuclear dialogue. Yes, it's in the works. We used to have one before. We are trying to re-establish that. I think there's no objection in principle. We're just trying to close that. And similarly on the Navy, we've agreed on a maritime dialogue earlier this year. I think it should happen soon. But we don't have the incidents at sea problem. I don't think the Indian Navy and the Chinese Navy have that kind of proximity to each other, which the US Navy and Soviet Navy had during the Cold War. So I think it's less an issue of avoiding an accident at sea or misunderstanding at sea. It's much more a better sense of communication on what are you doing and what am I doing. I think a big change in the relationship is that India and China are talking to each other on a whole lot of issues. Because we've had a Central Asia dialogue, we've had a West Asia dialogue. I think as we speak, we're probably having an Africa dialogue. So we're finding more and more regions to talk about. We didn't used to do this before, and I think that itself is part of an improving relationship. Whether we have an Afghanistan dialogue or something even more sensitive, it's hard to say. But I would certainly hope the direction is positive. So where we go, I won't put limits on it. But again, part of getting it right is to respect the sensitivities of the other side. And I think we need, if both sides kind of have a good feel for where you're comfortable and where you're not, I think it sort of helps talking. So I think in this 2-3 narratives that we're talking about, one fact stands out, which is that the ability of the Indian system and the Chinese system, not just to engage, but actually also to talk, is also growing. And I think that's good for both of them and for everybody else.
Well, I think we run out of time, and also we both invested very hard this morning, so I need to give his throat a rest. I think it's been a very good session, but before I close, I'm going to ask my panelists if they have any last words they'd like to start with the class. Do you have any last words you want to share with both of you? Okay. Anything? Any last words before I close?
1 minute.
Yeah.
I agree that Ambassador Jessica's remarks on just about following issues, China, India, China, United States, and others. I agree that, but we have to do more engagement and talk. I totally agree. That's why I said we have to build more regimes like track 1 or track 2, 3, like we do it with the United States 10 years ago. We already did that. So I hope we do more. Thank you.
Well, just one point, and this is something that Ambassador Pillai made in the morning yesterday, about the fact that the two countries do not understand each other very well. And I think this is at different levels, and one has to consciously engage at each level to better understand, because only then can you have a fruitful dialogue.
I think if one were to look at one big issue on which China and India have cooperated, I as an international lawyer would identify the assertion of the prohibition of the use of force. What we see now is a massive expansion by the hegemonic powers to ensure that the justification for the use of force is expanded as much as possible. We find interventions in Kosovo, in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, and possibly in Iran going to be justified on the basis of humanitarian intervention, R2P, the responsibility to protect, and other matters. So the consistency of the India-China objection to this expansion is pretty clear. We have a record of India and China joining together and ensuring that sovereignty is respected, that the norm of non-interference in states is preserved. And I think that would be, in my view, the biggest issue on which the two countries have shown quite a lot of predictability and consistency in their actions.
Well, in addition to engagement and talk, I would also like to urge, as a research institute and think tank, that we also need to research and study and reflect and discuss. This is exactly what we've been trying to do in the conference that started yesterday and which end today on a very high note, I must say, based on a very insightful, very analytical paper by the ambassador and very good discussions from our panelists. And as Chairman Pradip Pillai said yesterday, Singapore is a good position, a good environment to do this in because it has the ambience kind of situation where the tempers need not sort of be heated up on an honest exchange of views. And I'd just like to clarify that we did invite the Chinese ambassador to share the panel with us, but he's traveling, so he's not been able to be with us today. So it's always been our intention to provide a good platform for a good exchange of views, a balanced exchange of views, and I'm very glad that we've had this discussion. And I'd like to thank both my panelists and the floor for a very useful and constructive session this morning. Thank you all.
Thank you, discussants, and everyone who brought the open discussion. We are now invite Professor Tan to present the token of appreciation to Ambassador International. Ambassador Gopinath Pillai will present the appreciation to the Ambassador. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of today's symposium on India-China relations. A gentle reminder to drop your completed evaluation form into the feedback box on your way out. We would also like to inform you that the dialogue session with Mr. Jairam Ramesh, which was scheduled for 2:30 this afternoon, is cancelled due to unforeseen circumstances. Once again, on behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies, I thank you for your participation and have a great weekend. Thank you.